Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Crisis Advisory Group's latest climate conversation. This is the series where we do a deep dive into climate science with one of the CCAG resident experts and a special guest. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to be joined in conversation by Sir David King, the UK's former Chief Scientific Advisor and Chief Negotiator for the Paris Agreement, as well as founder and chair of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, and Kim Stanley Robinson, author of numerous award-winning books including his visionary novel of the near future, The Ministry for the Future. Or for the rest of this conversation, Dave and Stan. My name is Mitzi Jonelle Tan, and I'm a climate justice activist and leader from the Philippines. And firstly, I would like to thank you both so much for joining me today. I should start by saying that so many people have recommended the Ministry for the Future to me, so I was really excited when I was asked to join this conversation. And as we kick off this conversation, I thought I would take a moment to frame things. After all, what brings a scientist, a sci fi author, and an activist together? It's that CCAG thinks that we all have critical roles to play in the fight against the climate crisis, the climate disaster. And I hope today we can explore this intersection and why the three of us all agree that it is so important. So let me kick things off. Stan, your book, Ministry for the Future, opens with an ominous line: "It was getting hotter." As we consider the current geopolitical context, I can't help feeling that this phrase perfectly captures our current situation. If I come to you first, then, as part of the climate community desperately looking to create the change in the system needed in the world to avoid further climate disaster, what is the thing that gives you most hope today?
I am convinced that the situation worldwide is better than when I wrote Ministry for the Future in 2019. That was a darker time. Since then, the shock of the pandemic has given everybody a sense of the reality of how bad things can get if the biosphere becomes unfriendly to us. And now climate change is being taken more seriously than before, and the pace of work on it between fear and action has accelerated. So they talk about the great acceleration since World War II. Everything that can be measured has accelerated, but there are accelerations within that acceleration. And in the last 4 years, I think I've definitely seen that. I think everybody's seen it. So um, for what it's worth, the sense of crisis has increased in ways that are perhaps productive.
Thank you. And Dave, undoubtedly a healthy dose of hope today comes from climate science. So perhaps you can tell us about some of the science that is making you most hopeful.
Mitzi, I think the scientific developments that are badly needed and have only just begun to be investigated are into how we stop tipping points from tipping. And here, my best example is what's happening in the Arctic Circle region, where the rate of loss of Arctic ice over the Arctic Sea around the North Pole has been accelerating, and now we know that the ice on Greenland is melting, possibly irreversibly, leading to a 23-foot sea level rise globally on average. And not only sea level rises, but temperatures could rise rapidly as well as we lose methane from the permafrost. So what we need to do is learn how to refreeze the Arctic, keep it colder. And there are significant groups now beginning to work on this, and we've got to move quickly. So there are some really important things happening. I am not quite so sanguine, as I've just heard Stan saying that he feels things are moving in the right direction. I think for the first time ever, we now have people in the United States beginning to understand the nature of the challenge, whereas I would say in Europe and Britain, that has been understood for perhaps 25 years on a broad level. I would say perhaps in the Philippines as well. So what I fear is that we haven't moved quickly enough. We have wasted an awful lot of time. Now, you asked me about what makes me optimistic. What makes me optimistic is that humanity is forever inventive. We look at people who live on the permafrost up in the Arctic Circle region. We look at people who live in the deserts of the Kalahari, for example, the Khoisan people who've been living there for thousands and thousands of years and still do. We see people living under extreme conditions and managing that. This ingenuity has been thrown up in science in a remarkable way, but we need that ingenuity to be much more focused. I'm going to be much happier when I see that degree of focus.
Thank you both. It's interesting to always hear how people answer this question, because I actually personally used to hate getting the question, what gives you hope? Because I felt like I had to give this perfectly positive outlook of the future. And the way you both answered it was very realistic, where, hope isn't always this perfect thing. It is something that actually kind of looks pretty ugly sometimes. Like I feel like hope is there's a poem that goes, hope is a sewer rat. It's the thing that survives when everything else seems like at its darkest at its first time. And it really is something that's scary, and that actually leads on perfectly to something I'd like to ask you both about, which is geoengineering, something you both have a lot of thoughts about. Dave, you were already talking about it a little bit. Sticking with you here and what you were saying about focusing that ingenuity, can I ask you to share your thoughts on geoengineering as a concept? And I've heard you talk previously about biomimicry, so perhaps you could share with us what you see as a difference and the role of both.
So what I'm in favor of and working on in a number of different ways is what we call biomimicry, imitating natural processes and just repeating them at scale so that we get the products more clearly. I've already mentioned the business of refreezing the Arctic. So let me talk about how we might repopulate the oceans with the level of fish and mammals that existed 400 years ago before we started removing whales. Whales were removed from the oceans in the first discovery of oil, because these large baleen whales have a large amount of blubber, and so we sent ships around the world to catch every baleen whale we could, and we weren't catching them for their meat, we were catching them for their blubber. So before we found oil under the ground, we found oil in whales. The blue whale population is now less than 1% of what it was estimated at 400 years ago, and they performed a critically important function, eating krill 300 to 500 meters below sea level, and then coming up to the surface to breathe. We all knew that because of the amount of air they expelled from their lungs, but also to defecate, because when they're 300 meters below sea level, like every mammal, their orifices are jammed shut by the high pressure. So what they were doing is eating krill, coming up, defecating in the surface of the ocean where the sunshine shines onto the ocean, and that then means that it acts as fertile material. This is like a farmer putting fertile material on land, and within a very short space of time, you might have 1,000 to 5,000 square kilometers with a pod of whales coming up that is green with phytoplankton, absorbing a vast amount of carbon dioxide and at the same time acting as foodstuff for baby fish. So what we have is a system in which you're capturing carbon dioxide and you are also at the same time restocking the fish, because krill are formed in that process I've just described. Fish are formed in that process. And so what we know is that it is possible to imitate the function of the whales. And that for me is an example of a biomimicry operation. That doesn't mean we can just go ahead and do it. We have to check with very careful experiments that we're not damaging the oceans in any way at all. We don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. Geoengineering, my classic example of geoengineering would be putting sulfates into the stratosphere. And this is what Stan uses as an example in his wonderful novel. I think it's the most important novel to have been published this century, in which The Indians suffer a tremendous human loss due to heat stress, and this, by the way, is very likely to happen. And they decide they will unilaterally put sulfates into the stratosphere to cool the planet by reflecting sunlight away. Put it up in the stratosphere, you reflect sunlight away and keep the planet down below a little cooler. Now, that is a dangerous thing to do if we don't do experiments. So we also have to make sure that good experiments are conducted to see that there are no bad effects from putting sulfates into the stratosphere. That is, in a way, also biomimicry, because when there's a volcanic eruption, these sulfates go up into the stratosphere. But you need also engineering projects to put the sulfates up into the stratosphere artificially. So I'm happy to call that one geoengineering.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Dave. Go ahead, Stan. You talk about imagining geoengineering and the possible pitfalls in a compelling way. Dave already mentioned it a little bit, but could you share a bit more on your views?
Yes, thank you. And I've been inspired by talking to Dave on his, as part of his program at Cambridge. This was maybe even 2 years ago rather than one. But in any case, what he's been exploring and has inspired me to think about is not the geoengineering that is the sulfates in the atmosphere imitating a volcanic eruption with global effects and with very possible downsides in terms of harming the monsoons, etc. That's an emergency gesture, but are there smaller, more localized projects that really do engineer the geophysical system that don't seem to have such downsides and are more localized? So Dave's description to me of the whale project, the whale poop project, was inspiring because it's practical, it has positive effects, and it's localized, and it can be explored. It should be explored. Another one that I talked about in Ministry for the Future and described part of is also local. The glaciers that are running off of Antarctica and Greenland are the main sources of sea level rise. The glaciers are moving perhaps 10 times as fast as they did historically. And that's at least partly because meltwater has gone to the bottom of these glaciers and has lubricated them in their beds. So they're sliding down a water slide rather than clunking down a rock bed. So glaciologists have proposed that we suck the water out from under these glaciers and thump them back down onto their beds to slow them to their historical speeds. It would greatly help with our sea level problem. There aren't any obvious side effects, and there certainly don't seem to be any negative side effects to this process. And it's localized. It could be done. It uses oil industry expertise. It's what the oil industry is good at, and we don't want them to do what they are good at in terms of pumping oil out of the ground. So they have a replacement project to pursue. We can put them to good use. And there's even more development since I wrote Ministry along this front. So that's what I've been exploring recently. Can we slow down the glaciers in their slide into the sea? And if we can, oughtn't we try? Because sea level rise will be catastrophic for human civilization at the levels that these glaciers represent if they were all sliding into the sea. So back to the larger question, the sulfur, when people say geoengineering, they generally do mean sulfur dioxide injected into the atmosphere. The two have become one in people's minds, and it's widely regarded to be dangerous, and I think there's some truth in that. Right now, what I see people working on that's very important is governance issues. It's a hard thing to experiment on locally because really, until you try it globally, you don't know what will happen. But we know because of Pinatubo that you would perhaps cool temperatures for 5 years. But the governance issue is where the cutting edge is on that one. Now, how would we decide to do it, and who would regulate it? And this is not at all clear and is being discussed at the level of the UN, which is because it will be a kind of international treaty situation. So that's what I see going on there.
Thank you, Stan. It's interesting because I'm from the Philippines, and when Mount Pinatubo is talked about here, it's talked in a much different context. Because for us in the Philippines, it's just absolute destruction. But
Hmm.
I think when we talk about the climate crisis, there is a lot that we need to do, and there is everything that we need to do, and we should do as much as we can. But I'm always so critical about geoengineering, especially of the type that you were talking about with sulfates in the stratosphere, because a lot of it, as you were saying earlier, is a lot of it is up to imagination. There's a lot of it that isn't tested yet. As Dave was mentioning, it's so important that we have these experiments, but we also have to make sure that it's within the context of equity and justice, that people don't suffer because of these experiments. I know that there are some attempts of geoengineering experiments in Sweden on Sami land or the Sami indigenous land. And that is not the type of experiments in science for the people that we should be approaching and looking at. And it also can't be used as an excuse to keep emitting and using fossil fuels. I see that way too often where it's proposed as the solution, so that we can keep emitting. Like, oh, okay, it's okay that we're still doing this because we're gonna, you know, geoengineer our way out of the problem. That's not how it works. We need that phase out of fossil fuel. We need mitigation, and then we can also, of course, definitely need the other aspects as well, and really look into nature-based solutions. And you already both touched on this a little bit on how the importance of localized geoengineering is. But what are your thoughts on the potential for unilateral geoengineering, where one nation or a small group of nations might deploy a geoengineering solution without global consensus, as in Stan's book? Dave or Stan, and Yun, sorry.
I think, I mean, there's several points to be made. Experiments are not should not be at the scale where they cause problems. Right. So if we take the experiments that were intended to be done in Sweden but had to be terminated because of the NGOs objecting, if we do experiments of the kind that have recently been done in Mexico, this is putting no more than a few pounds of sulfates into the stratosphere to see whether the methodology of putting sulfates into the stratosphere actually works. Now, in order to have any impact on the climate, you need many, many tons of sulfates into the stratosphere, many, many hundreds of tons. So there's no way this is going to have any influence on the temperatures, the weather systems of the world. It's just a tiny drop in the ocean. So I think we need to understand experiments that are carefully conducted will not have an impact of the kind that that is likely to happen if it is just rolled out rapidly, which is what happens in Kim Stanley Robinson's book when the Indians just go ahead and do it to try and save their own population. All of this to me is an important lesson. Do the experiments. You have to do the experiments. Make sure that there are no negative consequences. And if we do the experiments now, then when we hit desperate situations such as that described in India, then we can operate the system with some sense of confidence that we're not going to cause disruption. But I think you asked a different question. Maybe you could pass over to Stan to answer the question.
Well, I would just want to suggest that geoengineering, as defined as this solar radiation management, sulfates in the atmosphere proposal, isn't a kind of a red herring, a false issue. It's an emergency gesture. If people start dying by the millions because wet bulb temperatures are being regularly reached, the global community knows they can imitate a volcanic eruption and cool the planet for 5 years. It's like a break glass in emergency, drastic step. And governance of it would be important. The world community would need to approve it. If a single nation did it, there's no law against it because there's no framework for the laws, not at this point. It's better now to focus, as Mitzi pointed out, on decarbonizing fast, because geoengineering is in a way a problem for the 2070s if we don't cope now. So fine, but why are we talking about it now? We should be talking about all the things like Sir Dave's projects, the smaller local things that will help the global situation in what look to be harmless ways or ways with very few downsides, like putting thickening the clouds at low altitude in the Arctic, like maybe sucking the water out from under the glaciers. These are local, they're partial. You could call them geoengineering, but that word itself is just a distraction from the more serious business and things to talk about right now that we can do. So I would say let's really talk about how can we divest from fossil fuels fast enough? How can we compensate the petrostates that are going to go bankrupt and then have social collapse when they stop selling their fossil fuels? These are the present questions that aren't getting enough attention because there's something charismatic about geoengineering. It's like talking about polar bears when you really need to be talking about bacteria. Geoengineering is a thing, but it's hypothetical and it's down the line. The real things happening right now need to be discussed, and some of them are crucially important. Some of these petrostates will keep burning their fossil fuels no matter what they promise at the COPs because they have to pay their bills. We need to compensate them to relieve them of that financial burden in ways that make them become member states in a larger decarbonizing world economy. These are tricky questions that are not as charismatic, but they may be more important.
Can I just chip in and support exactly what Stan's just been saying? I believe anyone working as I am on these problems needs to commit themselves to as close to zero emissions as possible as an immediate priority, right? So what we have today is an emission of 40 billion tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. When that agreement was reached back in 2015, which doesn't seem a long time ago to me, we were down at sub 30, and now we're at over 40, even after that global agreement was reached. Now, there's no way we are going to manage a future for humanity and for our civilization if we continue anything like in this manner. And we all have to make that commitment clear. And then when we get on with these other experiments and even rolling out, and I have to say, we've got to roll out refreezing the Arctic quickly because of the rate of loss of ice from Greenland, which would be devastating. By mid-century, it could be that 90% of Vietnam will be under seawater once a year at least, and that's less than 30 years from now at the current rate of sea level rise. So what we have is already exceeded our position on greenhouse gases. We've put too much up there. We've got to learn how to remove very large quantities of excess greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere, and we will also have to learn how to refreeze the Arctic and any other part of the climate system that appears to be going over its tipping point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, can I add to that the idea that we are going to put too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere despite our promises. It's becoming clearer and clearer that we are soon going to surpass the 1.5 degree global average temperature rise that we wanted to stick below. So we're going to have to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now that can happen by mechanical means, by making, in effect, giant vacuum cleaners. But it's also there, the biomimicry is crucial, or simply biology, reforestation. And what I've gotten interested in that I want everybody to think more about is being called regenerative agriculture, but it should be called decarbonizing agriculture or carbon drawdown agriculture.
Right.
We need food for 8 billion people. We're going to have to grow food. The agricultural fields of the world have sometimes only 1% of carbon by weight. They could have 3 or 4% of carbon by weight. And that differential is an enormous banking possibility of drawing down carbon as we grow our food. So we have a double good out of that. So regenerative agriculture, you asked Mitzi about reasons for hope. This is one of the great reasons for hope, that we can shift ag to make it into a decarbonizing activity and both feed ourselves and save our climate at in the same actions.
I'm curious then, could you talk a little bit more about regenerative agriculture and how this could happen, especially for our audiences who might not be as familiar with it?
Sure. I feared that it was just a name without much behind it, a kind of Potemkin or false front. I'm realizing I didn't need to have that fear. The agricultural community is very intently working on things like no-till agriculture or multi-crops in the same ground, of paying very close attention to what draws carbon down at the end of the process of growing food. And so the French have a project called 4 by 1000, which is to say, if you can draw down, I think it's 0.4 of 1% of carbon drawn down year by year, you quickly draw down as much CO2 as we've put up into the atmosphere. And so it's a substantial potential bank. The work is being done in, I think you can look up regenerative agriculture and find that the work is being led by the permaculture people from Australia and New Zealand, by the French, and by, in America, what used to be called organic farming. And there's even the possibility that ranching of cattle could be done in a way that that drew some carbon into the ranching grasslands. This is more speculative, but here again, as Sir Dave's been pointing out, we need widespread experiments to find out what works best. And here's what I focused on in ministry that I think is crucial, and I'm seeing good signs here too. We need to pay for these efforts. People can't do them voluntarily. People can't go into debt to do important research. They need to get paid for it. So now the central banks of the world and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are all scared enough to begin to think about direct finance, green carbon drawdown, green quantitative easing, the use of fiat money, which is to say nationally supported money, like the US dollar, the pound, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, being generated by governments and paid first for doing these kinds of good works, including regenerative agriculture. And this is another reason for feeling hopeful, that I think the sense of fear and dread since the pandemic and the latest IPCC report have been so extreme that everybody is reacting, saying, oh my gosh, we really do have to do something. And as Sir Dave pointed out, there have been people saying this for 25 years, but now push has come to shove. We have a decade or so to act before we've created enormous problems in the tipping point way. So you can sense this because of the bills that are being passed, like the IRA bill, and because of the treaties that are being signed, like the 30 by 30, 30% of the land left wild by the year 2030. The whole international community has signed off on things that would have been entirely utopian just 10 or 15 years ago. So I think maybe it's a sign of desperation or of fear, but things are happening.
Can I just add to what Stan's just said?
Go ahead.
So I'm sitting talking to you from Cambridge, which is in the middle of a very flat part of the UK, and it's a big agricultural area. And I would guarantee you that there are not many earthworms in the farmlands in this area because the agriculture here is not regenerative. Now, by this, I mean earthworms do the natural form of ploughing. So if you leave leafy material on the surface of the land, if you leave compost on the surface of the land, earthworms would come up and pull it down into the earth. And it also performs the function that when it rains, the earthworm passages that are left in the earth retain the water, and the water is retained deep down in the soil. So I think there are many, many advantages from regenerative agriculture getting back to the ability to use earthworms to perform their normal function. Why have we got no earthworms? Simply because of chemical treatments and chemical fertilizers being used by the farmers, which is, I'm afraid, deliberately aimed at getting rid of pests. And there's the problem. It's going to take quite a while, Stan, to persuade the agricultural community to switch over.
I
Yes,
really hope they do,
I,
though. Oh,
can I say though, in the States, 80% of the farms are really owned by individual families, and in the Midwest, they own rather large farms,
Yeah.
1,000 acres, 2,000 acres. They're growing corn, soybeans, wheat. They don't want to be beholden to Monsanto. They've
No.
had and the pesticide companies in general. They are signing contracts that make them the servants of corporate power. They would rather be free of that. The interest amongst farmers who you think of as being conservative and set in their ways, with a little financial help to make the transition, they are intensely interested in freeing themselves from corporate power and also making their land healthy for future
Yes.
generations, which is to say their soil. So amongst the farmers, there's a quick uptake in interest in regenerative ag. It's very encouraging to see.
Wonderful.
that's really interesting because majority of farmers or peasants in the Philippines are landless, and these are the large multinational corporations, the large scale landlords. They really control a lot of the monocrop plantations, which is causing soil degradation. Signing on to getting rid of all those pests. But I have had the opportunity to work with small farming communities that have taken back their land, and there you see that the land is thriving and they're planting the way that makes sense for the community, for the people, and for the planet. I feel like we all have so much to say about all these wonderful topics. But I wanted to touch on quickly about something you both mentioned earlier about the importance of financing both the science and the experiments, but also now helping farmers and agriculture and really all systems transition. And climate finance is something that we talk about a lot in the climate summits or COP28. And Stan, in your book, it depicts an international ministry working to combat climate change, but with a sense of frustration that its hands are tied. It can't move fast or far enough due to obstruction from other players. And I wanted to touch on this and get your thoughts, especially because we also see how the COP28 presidency this year is an oil tycoon. So I wanted to get your thoughts. Like, what were you thinking? How do you both feel about these things?
Well, there's a lot to discuss there, and I'm going to try to be brief. This is a test of the UAE as host of COP28 and as an oil power. They're going to be trying to define a transition to post fossil fuels world from within a very constrained and you might say bizarre position of being an oil power. But the pressure's on them to do something significant and interesting. So COP28 will be fascinating to watch because they are going to try to look good. They might even try to be good. And they have to be given the opportunity to show a way forward for petrostates like themselves. The financing, COP27 established a loss and damage fund, but it's empty of funds. And so right now, the World Bank and the IMF, and they have been bad. They have been imperial power, turning countries like the Philippines into cash crop dependencies. It's really a form of colonialism that's financial rather than military. But they're young, they're more your age than mine. They're young. They know the emergency. They're thinking with this amount of power, with this amount of money, could we perhaps prime the pump for private capital to move in behind us and provide insurance and security for them to make investments and get the world to invest in a green transition. So I would say, just like the UAE, the World Bank and the IMF need to be given the chance to prove they're in a new mindset, and they might.
Thank you, Dave.
So I'm going to take it just one step further. You asked about climate finance, and I'm going to say, first of all, what sort of finance do we need in order to accelerate all of the processes we've been discussing and many others? And we need to see that trillions of dollars go into this arena. Now, this isn't going to be misspent money at all if it's done properly, because we're managing risk to future societies, risk to future cities. If Americans understand that cities like New York are going to go underwater unless we manage this, in a way, for example, that the Dutch do understand and have understood for years that rising sea level is a big threat to them. If people in the United States understand that, then you start investing in risk management. So risk management is one part of this process, but the other part is the result is going to be a cleaner world. If we stop using fossil fuels, the air that we breathe is going to be much, much cleaner. And you and I have been, I'm sure, in cities where you haven't felt that it's a healthy place to be, to breathe the air that is available to everybody. And it doesn't have to be in Delhi, it doesn't have to be in Beijing. Many of our cities are very, very unhealthy. And that's because we're using fossil fuels and not protecting ourselves from the exhaust systems of those fossil fuels. So I think we've got to understand that the financial commitment is a commitment to our generation, but more particularly future generations. There needs to be a much better understanding about investing in future generations. And Stan absolutely rightly pointed out we have to help other countries which can't afford to manage these challenges as well as the more advanced economies can. I think the impacts of climate change are going to be everywhere. Don't pretend that it's not going to hit everybody. But at the same time, the hardest impacts are going to be on those countries that can ill afford the adaptation required to manage the process of climate impacts as they continue to emerge in a worse way.
Exactly. And as our countries in the global south, experience the worst of these climate impacts, we have to make sure that the climate finance that comes in the form of grants and not loans. To me, it makes absolute no sense that our countries who are trying to deal with the climate crisis go into debt to the countries that caused the climate crisis. And it's especially the younger generation that will be paying off these loans in the long term. And that's something that I know a lot of people are also working on with initiatives like debt for climate or debt cancellation or debt relief. And we have financial economic reforms happening with the World Bank and IMF with things like the Bridgetown Initiative by Mia Motley and other wonderful initiatives. But unfortunately, we are almost out of time. So I have one last question for the both of you. And I started by asking about the hope that you both feel. But in order to bring hope, I think we all agree that we need to see real and lasting change. So I'm going to ask you each if you could change one thing in the world tomorrow in the fight against climate change, what would it be? I'll give you time to think and I can go first. I would say it's the way that we, especially the people in power, value people in nature. The way that we see ourselves as separate from biodiversity, the way that we see ourselves as separate from other people, especially people who are more marginalized. We need to change the system from a profit-oriented system to a needs-based one. And there are way too many ways how to get there, but I'm sure we will one day. Dave, do you have an answer?
I'm going to quickly, if I may, just say I strongly support what you've just said. I'm continually saying we're not apart from nature, we are a part of nature. And we have, I'm afraid, learned the wrong lesson over the last many hundreds of years by using nature as our dustbin. We're wrecking our own future. But let me put my big wish before you, and you may be surprised to hear this. I believe that if China and the United States, and they would probably be joined by the European Union, were to sit together and set out a strategy to manage the risks of climate change and to announce their strategy and put their effort behind it, the rest of the world would fall in behind them.
Yes. Yes. I can only second that. That would be beautiful. And I want to revert to what you were saying in terms of what I would like to see change. People regard money with a kind of mystical possessiveness of, greed and fear. Money is a social relation and a political gesture. And so what I'd like to see is the big rich countries, China, US, EU, create, and maybe the loss and damage fund of the COP system can be used as this place. $2 trillion a year per year, made up from scratch out of nowhere, and not as loans but as grants given out to do good climate work. This is Nicholas Stern. I'm sure Sir Dave has worked with him before. They must be colleagues. This is a plan outlined by them. And so we don't have to have some countries begging rich countries for a handout, but rather an organized international source of funding to do the necessary work. And I sincerely hope that happens.
Thank you both. We are going to make sure that it happens, because nothing is impossible. Another world is possible. And thank you both for joining me. And I hope everyone at home enjoyed this as much as I did. If you want to find out more about CCAG, you can go to the website www.ccag.earth or at Climate Crisis AG on Twitter and Instagram. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Mitzi.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Dave. Yeah.
And thank you, Stan.
Yeah.